A very warm welcome. So please relax, eat something, drink something, and listen to the show. We keep this brief and to the point because this is only the beginning of the discussion. We are from the PtX Hub, which is part of GIZ, and sustainable development are the two keywords of GIZ. So we want to help emerging and developing countries to take full advantage of Power-to-X, so to build their renewable energy economy and use hydrogen as a little helper. But it has to be sustainable. And today we are very proud to launch our foundations document that you see here on the screen. We came up with 4 dimensions, the EESG, and my colleague Heino will explain it in more detail. This is just the foundation, and with all of you, we want to discuss how we take it from here and make it a very useful and very practical document. Right now, Johanna Friese should talk to you, and I'm obviously not Johanna Friese. She's a colleague of mine at the PtX Hub, and she got sick, unfortunately, and had to stay in bed, so I took her place. We will start with a very short 10-minute presentation of a very thick document, which is 60 pages long. And when you see this little postcard, you see a QR code, and there you find the document. And of course, you can find us, and we send the document to you, or you go to our website, ptx-hub.org. But now we get a very brief overview of the main elements by Heino von Meyer. Heino is with the PtX Hub from the beginning, since 2019, before he was a director with the OECD. And we benefit a lot from his vast network and rich experience. And he's the main author of this document. So any questions directed to him. Once he's done, we have 4 panelists that quickly react to it. So to be fair, those individuals only learned about their job like 2 days ago. So we just want your initial reactions. What do you think about this document? And what would you advise would be the next step? How can we make it very useful, and who has to be involved? That will then be Nika Hohmann, President of Sustainable Hydrogen Club, Arun Sharma, Head of Sustainability and Advisor to Chairman of the Adani Group, Gavin Heyman, Executive Director, Open Contract and Partnership, and Samit Ahua of Impact Air and Board Member of Sea Ganga from India. But first, I'd like to ask Heino to take my place here and walk us through the document. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you for going your lunch and coming to listen to yet another presentation. It will be live streamed, so we will not be alone in the end. I will quickly run you through our thinking about PtX sustainability, maybe starting with why PtX. Initially, when we set this up at COP 25, it was in Madrid, there was a debate, should we be the green hydrogen hub? We decided to go for PtX, indicating that we go beyond hydrogen into all the many possible use options. Now, I hope this works. For this audience, I probably don't have to explain why we need PtX, but it is in the end to meet the Paris climate goals, and we need to close the what I call the Paris Delta. This is global energy-related CO2 emissions, and you're familiar with these kind of graphs. And for that, we need energy efficiency improvements in all sectors. We need renewable energy increasingly towards 100%, and electrification wherever possible. However, there is a remaining loophole where a lot of industries think, well, we will slip through that one. But if we are serious and we want to reach climate neutrality by 2050 and reach net zero, then we only will close that gap if we use green hydrogen and Power-to-X for those sectors of industry and transport that cannot directly electrify. Now, there is in the current debate a great risk that all the debate is about decarbonization, carbon emissions. And no doubt, that is probably the most important debate. However, there are other important issues. Let's take biodiversity loss. Let's take the water crisis. Let's take poverty and inequality. So there are more important and let's say other important, not more important issues that at least we need to take into account if we go for decarbonization. And you know the SDGs, same year as the Paris Agreement in 2015, even a few months earlier. And those are 17 different goals and to be reached in actually 8 years. And you get lost a bit in those 17. So there have been efforts to structure them at least into 3 layers, which we would call planet, people, and prosperity. It's actually Rockström who created the so-called SDG wedding cake. I tried to translate it into a pyramid. At the bottom, you have the concerns number 13 on the very right, climate action, but also life below water, life on land, and clean water and sanitation. And then comes the social dimension. I will not go into all the details, but it's about poverty, hunger, health, and then prosperity or the economic dimension with economic growth, industrial innovation, and so on. And as an overarching goal, partnerships for the goals. So economy, society, biosphere, or call it environment. So the structuring was a background to our conceptualization of what we call the EESG framework. ESG is pretty much used now in the finance and banking sector for financing and investment. We added another E because we think that in particular for developing and emerging economies, the economic dimension of sustainable development should be also taken seriously into account. Now, if we assess sustainability and also in the PtX context, we need to be clear of what we are talking about. Are we talking about a product, X tons of hydrogen, or are we talking about an investment project, or are we talking even about designing support policies for PtX? So, and depending on that specific purpose, the actual translation of the dimensions and concerns into practical measurements will be different. So we look at the environmental dimension, at the economic dimension, the social, and the governance dimension. So we identify those 4 dimensions, and from the long list of concerns around hydrogen and Power-to-X, we tried to cluster them into 4 clusters of concerns for each of the 4, so basically creating 16 boxes. You could probably create different clusters, but in order to organize the debate. In the environmental dimension, it is about where does the energy come from, or in particular, the electricity. It is about the carbon cycle. Is it closed? Where does the carbon come from? And then water, land, and biodiversity issues in the discussions, they have come up pretty often already. We need to look at that more carefully. Then we address the issue of resources and recycling, and obviously general pollution risks. I'll go into some of those aspects a bit deeper in a minute. The economic dimension, of course, it's about creating global or local value chains. And we need to carefully look at the energy mix of countries, because in a lot of countries which are currently discussing export perspectives, their own domestic electricity still is very much dependent on fossils. So trade issues have been discussed just some minutes ago. Now, the social dimension, water, we discussed on the environment, but it clearly access to water, access to electricity are major issues, jobs and health, and finally the governance dimension with the policy commitment of countries translated into hydrogen strategies or PtX, roadmaps, transparency and participation, important dimensions. As I said, distinguish the levels from the products and specific plants to projects and production processes to policies, and also obviously we need to find out, are we talking about national level policies, or is it about a local context in which we operate? Now, quickly translating this into a vision that looks at the entire value chain, and we have this nice animated GIF to make it even a bit more fancy. So we talk about the renewable energies at the start, and there the issue is, of course, renewability. We want renewables. However, those renewables should not be taken from the grid and therefore undermine the national transition of the energy system. So it should be additional. We can discuss if what the EU is publishing today in terms of additionality, if that's a helpful concept of conceptualizing additionality, or if developing countries, emerging economies need to have a different way of ensuring that this is additional. But beyond the power generation issue, it is the water issue. Water stress, where we have sun and wind, we often have water stress, so the water footprint is important. Desalination is necessary in many cases. And if you are doing it, and since the additional costs are marginal, then think about co-benefits that maybe also the neighboring community is able to improve its water supply, or farming communities, etc. So then renewable energy and hydrogen and water go into the electrolyzer. In electrolysis, something that's not been mentioned a lot, we are dependent on critical raw materials. In addition, those are very much concentrated in the hands of not a few countries, but actually one. So that's an issue. Of course, you cannot solve that at the product level, even at the plant level, but strategically, politically, it's an issue that we should and must take into account. So we have addressed this in our paper. Then moving on to the Ptx synthesis, where you combine the hydrogen with either nitrogen to produce ammonia, or with CO2 in Fischer-Tropsch to produce, in the end, a liquid, power to liquid for aviation. There, the issue is very much, where does the carbon come from? What are the sources? Are those sources where we have a closed carbon cycle? And then in the end, we need a whole range. And now I'm lost here. What did we do? Okay, seems to go on. Now, let's move to the social dimension. I already said energy poverty in a lot of countries in Africa, still less than half the population is connected to the grid. In that context, exporting renewables to Europe may be a bad idea, at least from a social perspective and in terms of acceptance in the region. The same, access to water, I already addressed. Of course, there is a hope that this new energy and then industry value chain will create jobs, but we need the proper qualifications and we have to respect the ILO labor standards. And coming to the economic dimension, I think this is pretty obvious. We want to develop value chains, the energy transition and energy mix I already mentioned. The question that needs attention is, what is the balance between domestic development and export orientation? My feeling is, not only in this event, but also in a lot of discussions in Germany, it is very much about where do we Germans get our green hydrogen from, and the perspective of what's good for the producing countries is maybe not sufficiently addressed. So we at GIZ, we really focus on the benefits for the partner countries. And then, of course, the whole issue balance between private and public investment. Finally, the policy commitment is important. Are those strategies integrated and coherent with the NDCs for the climate issue? And I was very pleased that, for example, yesterday, the governor of Rio Negro mentioned that for them, an anti-corruption clause in the contracts was very important. I was surprised because when we put this in here, people say, oh, now you're overloading it, etc. No. There is, I think, evidence that if you don't get those things right, then a lot of other problems follow suit. Participation. Participation is really key, not just of stakeholders, but of local communities in the preparation of development projects. And finally, we need regulatory frameworks to implement certification, and I mentioned it in the earlier session. Once we have proper certification, maybe we don't even have to transport all of the stuff. So if you have aviation fuel certified in Chile, Lufthansa can buy the certificate, but the fuel is used in Chile and not transported to Germany to be put in a plane there. That's the broad picture, the last slide. So how do we come now from the concerns to criteria and certification? One way is to become more specific. We need the data, we need the indicators, so agreement on those. We need to develop the standards, and you were in the room yesterday. I think it's an important standard, and it fits within our network, our conceptual framework nicely. That's why we participated in this exercise, because we thought this is really a serious attempt. But we need to define the thresholds. We need to define the timelines until when we have to reach what level. And then the whole issue of the certification, accreditation, etc., will still need some attention. But apart from that, becoming more specific, I think a lot of the issues I addressed will be dealt with in due diligence assessment for the supply chains. So that's a different exercise than stamping something as clean and green, but to ensure, or to at least to make clear, that you have taken measures to do risk analysis. Once you identify serious risks, you do a risk management, and you do monitoring and reporting about your risks. And again, stakeholder participation and community involvement are important to ensure this, and for that you need grievance mechanisms where dubious cases can be brought up, whistleblowing, and finally remedy. Sorry, I probably ran out of my 10 minutes, but with that, please have a look at the 60 pages. It's not possible to do it in shorter time, and I really look forward to very brief reactions. We will not have the time for full debate, but we will take this on. It's a living document. We will refine it, and we are grateful for your inputs. So over to our moderator.
Take a seat. Take a seat, Heino. Right. Thank you so much. Please take a seat. We have 4 reactions to the presentation. If you could just come up and take a seat as well. Well, thanks, Heino, for condensing this very rich document into 10 minutes. Maybe it was 12, I don't know. And you already alluded to the fact, okay, there have been other works in the same direction, but we believe we are more holistic, we are more broad, but still the question would be, are we broad enough? Are all dimensions and concerns included? The second that you were saying, well, there may be different use cases. So you could apply to a product, to a project, to a policy. And the question would be, what's your view on that? What is more important than the other? Have we forgotten something? And then different use cases. So are we doing that in order to label a product it is sustainable, or is it for a due diligence of a company? Is it for a local community to check whether the sustainability concerns they are relevant for them are adhered to? So there are different things that one can do with this thing, and we would be very, very interested what you think should be the next step, or what you first think about this product and what the next step would be. I would love to start with you, Nike. Yes, and your reaction, please.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for addressing the very important subject. Of course, we are at the start of a global green hydrogen economy. So we have to implement it in the next years. So we are designing it and implementing it in a fast way. So, but we're going to change the energy system with it. But as you showed, we're also going to change, and we can change the social system with it. So the social economic system can be, well, changed dramatically in a positive way if we think about all these subjects. So I really loved it that you look at it at several levels. So that's wonderful. But what I missed, actually, you talked about the co-benefits, and that's good. It is really is wonderful, but it can bring prosperity. It is not only about the mitigation, and you mentioned the co-benefits, but it can really contribute to prosperity, because energy brings prosperity. And so the social economic part, as we had the social and the economic part, I think we can do much more, and it really brings us more prosperity. And yeah, you said also that it might not be the best way to trade between countries and from emerging countries to, like, for example, Europe. But we think that it might also be possible to bring prosperity to the regions in a trade deal. If you have mutual benefits and you make it part of the trade deal, and you involve, for example, an SDG impact assessment from the start. So really in the early process stage, you can really see, well, what is the gap from the ESGs or the SDGs, and how can we contribute to reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by bringing green hydrogen to a region and bring prosperity to a region. So I think this is a good start, definitely. And we need it. We need a framework like this, but I think we can do more. Use it to bring prosperity, not only mitigation, and see if it's important to look at water impact or the stability of the grid, but also bring green energy to the local communities, to the small and medium enterprises, but also, for example, use the water for irrigation, regreening the land. We can do much more. And now we are at the start of designing and implementing this new green global hydrogen economy. Now is the moment. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nika, for the Sustainable Hydrogen Glove. We count you in developing it further. Like to turn to Aaron Jama to get more private sector perspective. What can we do with this wonderful document?
Well, thank you. Am I on? Yeah. Well, thank you. I think a lot of work has gone in preparing this document, and it's a great start. I think one of the things that one has to look at is exactly the purpose of the document. And there are multiple purposes. And the way you get a framework like this accepted and widely adopted is if you look at different needs where it provides a ready solution and it does not replicate other sort of initiatives where people are basically filling up data over and over again. And so here are a few examples that I would like to suggest. And then I will also put a word of caution towards the end. And what parallel development can make it very successful. So if you look at the European Union has come up with a project framework. So if you are going to apply for a project, then how do you calculate the greenhouse emission? And yes, I know it's only around carbon, but it's about greenhouse emissions. It's about what is the first operational year of the project, how much it will be. So already there is a mechanism. Now, one thing that you could work with the European Union to say that we want to take your framework for project management and for green hydrogen or PtX projects, could we add this other dimension in the evaluation criteria? So you do that, then you suddenly have got a lot of traction with this, where you are taking their simple greenhouse emission calculation to a broader sort of context. So that's one way of looking at it. More broadly, at a global level, EU is looking at cross-border taxation. And as it comes up with the framework of cross-border taxation, how it implements it will have to be very nuanced. It can't just have a blanket, okay, this is the grid intensity of a particular country, and we are going to tax you based on your grid intensity. And that takes all innovation by the private sector in that country away and doesn't sort of reward them. So there you have a mechanism by which private sector in countries that are trying to sell to the EU in the future can adopt the framework to demonstrate that they should be the preferred import partners for European companies. So that's another use case that happens. But ultimately, the challenge we all are facing is there are sustainable projects around the world that are looking for funding. And there is capital around the world looking for sustainable projects, and they can't find each other. Well, it's not that they can't find each other. They bump into each other all the time. There is a trust deficit. Okay, there is a trust deficit because how do these sustainable projects demonstrate to these capital providers that my project meets this criteria? Now, what you're doing could be one mechanism by which the projects can distinguish themselves in the market for capital that is looking to invest in sustainable ideas. And so those are some of the use cases where it will be useful to adopt the framework, because then you really start seeing, is it adding value or not, other than just another PtX sustainability report that goes with the project and no one reads, okay? Ultimately, many of these things will require a blockchain framework that will come out of green hydrogen and the issues of provenance and the issues of traceability on each of those ideas will require. We're not going to get this framework overnight, but green hydrogen is an area which actually will have to do something about it, because there is no way they can differentiate themselves from gray, blue, and other colors of hydrogen. So I think that will be there. Now, the word of caution. ultimately, this is going to become an issue between the developing world and the developed world. It's perfectly fine for the developed world to come up with all these frameworks and outcompete each other in doing good for society, when the concerns of the developing world are survival, economic development. And a framework like this that does not take the burden on entities in the developing world could appear as an indirect form of trade barrier, okay, if you sort of implement it extremely well. So that is what you have to be extremely concerned about with this framework. So with those few points, I think it's a great work.
Wonderful points. Much things to think about. Samit, you take the view of an investor, so maybe you can just continue the thoughts that we heard before. And also kind of in what kind of product would we need to produce out of this foundation document to make it very useful for investor? And do we need different products for different constituencies, for different countries? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Frank, and I know inviting me on the panel. I didn't have the 2 days. I had less than 24 hours, but for what it's worth, no, it's fantastic that you brought this, codified this framework. We talked about this last evening, and where you have the box economic, we call it impact. So instead of EESG, we said ESGI. Says the same thing in a different set of characters. Frank, to your point on what are the views of the investors, my colleague just mentioned that there's enough capital out there chasing good projects. Now, the developing world's concerns are very rightly put, very, very different from developed world concerns. At the moment, if you look at most of the funds, institutional funds, their charter does not allow them to invest outside OECD countries, right? So you're chasing projects in your home markets. So there's more money, less projects. That means there's inflation going to kick in. The projects will become pricier and pricier. Challenges of emerging markets are largely currency risks, right? So if I invest in euro, dollar, sterling, the volatility in currencies, the depreciation of currencies is a big problem. So how do you move this massive trillions of dollars of ESG money that's sitting out there and utilize it for the needs of both developed and developing world? So we need to now look at this framework and how do you transpose it onto the money markets, and how does that money from pension fund, sovereign fund, insurance funds trickle all the way down to a village 50 kilometers outside Mombasa or Bangalore. That's the connection we need to make. And unfortunately, many of the financial experts find that very, very hard, because you have to deal with subsidy-driven policy frameworks. There's no clear market mechanism available for making that money connect to the village on the ground. Governments, civil society, and industry all have to come together to connect. A lot of the governments still talk about GDP growth. We don't talk enough about per capita growth, right? So how do I bring $2,000 a month income to somebody who's currently earning $100 a month, right? And that's creation of jobs. I was speaking to a few villages in India, and they said all our kids don't want to be in farming anymore. They all want to go to the cities and drive Ubers and what have you, because they get access to jobs, right? Modern jobs. And the reason they're moving to cities is because there's no energy, right? And if you don't have energy, you don't have industry, micro industry that may be. So a lot of them use old school farming mechanisms. So I think two things we have to do to bring this framework down to the level is, how do I bring sustainable agriculture? So how do you transpose this framework into sustainable agriculture? 2/3 of the world, emerging world, lives in agrarian belts, right? And for that, they need access to water and power, right? So they produce the goods, produce the food, but there's no mechanism to process it or transport it or store it. So there's a lot of food wastage that goes, and in this day and age, that's a crime. So agriculture and energy have to go hand in hand, in my opinion. So to what you've done at a policy framework level, you need to codify it for different industry segments. And I'll start with energy and agriculture. And then you create a bank of projects which you aggregate and then connect to the money markets.
Thank you so much. That's certainly a dimension that we haven't fully considered. Gavin, I'd like to turn to you now. So you are concerned with contracts, public contracts, to make them transparent, open, fair, efficient. Can we help you in any way with our sustainability work?
Great. So thank you very much. I broke my pen taking notes, so apologies. I put some comments down on the computer instead. So I guess my first response is I really appreciate that someone's taken the time and the care to map out the whole territory, right, on Power-to-X and thinking about green hydrogen and ancillary businesses and industries, and to look at kind of how you can fit things together into an overarching kind of framework. You know, you said avoiding just that carbon tunnel vision, and you're thinking about a just transition rather than just a transition. So I just think that's really helpful, and just want to kind of appreciate that, because it's very easy just to focus on the carbon side of things. I think I liked the way you spoke about the joining up between the policies, the projects, and the products, and how you look at fitting those together. I think that new E you've added, as in economic, is incredibly important, and particularly around inclusive economic development. And you drew out the opportunity, particularly for local value chains. We work a lot on public procurement and rethinking public procurement as a kind of smart digital service. But one of the key things there is to really design for how you include small businesses, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and really rethinking supply chains to be inclusive in that way. And so I appreciate that you are already putting that on the framework. I think you've also highlighted the importance of governance, right? And that's really my area of expertise. But unless we get that right, the rest of it will be fragile, probably won't be sustainable. Policies will be perhaps fickle, easily changed. And you don't want just a huge amount of investment that will be coming from the private sector. No, it's just to reinforce vested interest in existing power dynamics that keeps poor people poor. So I think that's all really important. I do think that is something of a comparative advantage for GIZ. I know you do excellent governance programming around the world. And I like the way you were talking about there's both the transparency, accountability angle. Absolutely, there's a public contracts angle. And obviously the Green Hydrogen Organization has launched this making hydrogen contracts work for people and planet. That'll be the next session in this room, quick advert. But thinking about what the frameworks and approaches are, and using kind of the best legal minds to design for really kind of effective contracts, very different, say, the oil, mining and gas industry. Other things that jumped out to me, I thought the local power generation issue was really important. And yeah, if everything green goes for export, but everything kind of dirty and fossil based is for local development, that just doesn't feel right. And I do think that's sometimes the Achilles heel of our discussions about green hydrogen, and something we really have to confront. So I think it's great that you baked that in, that equity and fairness and green for all approach from the start. I'm a massive fan of data and indicators. That said, when you're dealing with perhaps governments that are new to this, less can be more. So it's easy to say, my God, we have a holistic framework. Here's 400 indicators you can track. And it's like trying to drive a car with a dashboard with like that many lights on. It's just going to be difficult. So I love the fact you're thinking about it. I think, trying to work out what the key data indicators could be, where you could start, where you could go deeper. We often think about, we say a no code, low code, and like code environments, thinking about the kind of level of like bureaucratic and government digitization and sophistication of dealing with this approach. And then lastly, I love the fact you were talking about use cases. And I thought perhaps one thing that struck me from your presentation was this could be a bit of a kind of framework readiness tool for governments to think through all these angles in their planning. I've seen that done very well for huge infrastructure projects. And like, have you thought about all these dimensions, and what's the kind of checklist for you to do that? if you were to take that approach, I guess you'd want to speak to governments and kind of design backwards, taking this framework and seeing what's most relevant and cogent to them. What's the kind of flow of business decisions they need to make? You know, how do you consult stakeholders when? How do you do that? So sort of designing it to really think about the specific use cases by speaking to the users. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Lots of additional points. What's absolutely clear to us, to the PtX Hub, that this is not a document that we have produced because our minister has asked us to do and we put it on the shelf and that's it. We really want to use it and use it for the different use cases that you also help to identify. I know, I give you the chance now to quickly react to some of the points and to let us know where we take it from here and how people in the room and people that are listening online can get involved.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I would love to engage now in a proper discussion, which will not be possible. First point, as Frank said, if you look carefully at the title, we avoided on purpose the term standard, criteria, etc. It is dimensions and concerns, and it's towards a conceptual framework for standards. And it's clear that, yes, there will be steps to adjust it to what Arun said, what's the purpose? You were missing the purpose. And we start as GIZ talking to administrations in developing countries. That's one interlocutor. The other is German ministries. The next is H2 Global coming up with a scheme. What kind of sustainability criteria are necessary? So very different purposes, and we know we have to translate, become more specific, etc. But at least it should be a coherent framework in which we can position this. I very much liked your point. Let's be more explicit even about the positive side, the prosperity side. That's why already I thought by adding the economic dimension, we would get out of this, oh, the environmental risks, oh, the social risks, and see really the economic potential, and in particular for strengthening local productive networks and value chains. That's very much something which, if you read the paper, I think we've tried to do this. The local dimension is very clearly there. And I think also Arun said, look, I need the purpose, and the economics in the end drive it all. And I take that critical remark at the end. Yes, there is a big risk that we're building up hidden or even explicit trade barriers, and that we come again from the north with top-down ideas. That's not the intention, but there is a big risk. And that's why I'm trying to stress, get the local people who are actually the ones for the projects, etc., involved. And I trust that they will bring up the messages that help to improve the sustainability of the projects. And in that, by the way, blockchain technology would be a fantastic issue to discuss, not now. And Samit, yes, I think you perfectly described it from a developing country perspective, how difficult it is to deal with local development ideas and concepts, and the risk if we come with some abstract top-down concepts. We need to translate that properly. But I mean, I have a rural development background before I entered into this, so I very much agree with you that we need to get this rural dimension, not just the urban and industrialized world, together. In Africa, a lot of the rural communities are not wired with copper cables. They manage to leapfrog in the communication sector. They have no fixed line telephone and everything goes mobile. Why not try to do the same in the energy sector with hydrogen? If you have not the big transmission lines, can use your energy by translating it into hydrogen as a buffer, and then maybe finally go for 3D printing, etc. I would love to go that way further, not getting too long. And yes, clearly, thank you, Gavin. The issues you raised, in particular also with regard to the governance dimension that needs to be taken serious, those I fully agree, but I also take your hints to where we should dive deeper. And I would love to continue our debate, maybe in other settings. Now we are rushed, but it was great to have you, and actually for us, really a pleasure to have the opportunity. Thank you.
And
the closing word comes from Frank.
What you haven't answered is what's the next step, but you kind of put it here. So you put your cell phone number, so we all WhatsApp you from now on, and your email. So I take it that you're open for anyone who would like to contribute, who would like to get involved in moving this further. As we were saying, on the website, you find the document. Please have a look, please get in touch. Heino's leading it on our team, but there are many more behind the scene that are also working. So we have a team of like 3, 4, 5 that will work on the topic. And we really would like to make it as useful as possible. So let us know and help us to get there. Thank you very much. Hope that was interesting to you. I hope there's still some lunch for those who didn't grab anything beforehand. Thank you to the speakers for your flexibility to jump in at very short notice. And thank you, Heino, for a wonderful presentation.
And maybe Gavin wants to make some advertisement for his session in this room in a few minutes.
Just stay in this room and you hear about contracting, right? Okay, thank you so much to the audience.